Hopefully you had a few minutes to get yourself a coffee, maybe step outside and enjoy some of the fantastic California weather that we're blessed with, and I think it will likely last all week. And I was just watching Twitter. I think we're actually starting to trend here, so I think that should be our goal for the week. I think Mar from Spain is bringing up our Twitter feed, so if she can carry on, keep tweeting. But I think our goal for the week is to get us trending above OCE discovery and Monday motivation, which are the two things that are beating us right now. So if we can get there, then all the better. So for the next topic, we're going to raise up a little bit. Not that we weren't sort of flying at the 60,000 foot level a few seconds ago with Vint and Satya, but we'll talk about big picture, studying a nation's web sphere over time, looking at analytical and methodological considerations. And to have that talk with us, we have Niels Brugger from Aarhus University in Denmark. He's the Associate Professor of Aesthetics and Communication. And Ditte Laursen from the Danish Net Archive, and she's a senior researcher there. So please, warm welcome for them.
Thank you. And it's a pleasure to be here. I also enjoy the sunny California. I actually got a little bit sunburned here yesterday. But I'm going to talk to you about a small project where... Pardon? Is it okay? I would prefer stand here because I can't read. This is my manuscript. I'm going to talk about about this project about studying a nation's web sphere, and it's a project that we're running in Denmark. And we is the NetLab and the Center for Internet Studies. We are the scholars studying it, and then we have the Danish Web Archive, NetArchive. Ditte, she's actually both because she's a scholar and part of the NetArchive. And then we have a third author, and it's not Andy, although he's sitting there. It's Janne Nielsen, is a research assistant back home in Aarhus. But I'm going to talk about the following points here. First, a few words about the project. Why study an entire national web domain's development, and how to do it. Introduce you to our analytical design. Then some of the methodological challenges. Ditte is going to talk about that, the solutions, possible solutions at least, and some of the results. And I'm going to say now that it's preliminary results. First about the registry of DK domains, and then I'm going to talk about a corpus creation. It's going to be more clear, of course, when we get there. And then a few words about the next steps. So the project, why should we actually study a nation's web domain? And what we want to do is to study what has the national web domain looked like and how has it developed. What are the methodological challenges in conducting such a study? And what kind of research infrastructure is needed to make such a study. So these are the main questions. It's important, of course, I guess no one here will disagree, because the web is part of our cultural heritage, so we have to study it. But studying an entire national web is important to me, to us, because we consider it a backcloth for all the activity on the web. To be more specific on that, if you want to study websites, for instance, or web pages, it could be a good thing to know what was actually the background on which all these websites were kind of taking place way back in the past. So that's our way of conceptualizing it. And then we would also like to identify some patterns in the development, some things that we haven't kind of been aware of that could be obvious when we start to see the development of a national web in its entire kind of in its entire being. So what are we going to study? What are we going to try to analyze? These are the main points in a bullet list: the size, space, structure, aliveness, and content. I'm going to elaborate on each of these points right now. First, the size, simply how big is the web domain? And when I talk about web domain, I also have to emphasize that. It is the .dk domain, .dk, the Danish domain. Of course, we know that there is Danish material outside the Danish domain. For this project, we have left that out, at least in the beginning. So the Danish web domain is defined as .dk. So how big is this domain? Different file types, how big are they? How big are files in general? Has that developed throughout time? And websites, how big, how small are they? And has that developed? And we also already have some initial ideas about that. The websites in the beginning, they were quite small, and there were only very few that were very big. And maybe this is still the case. We're finding out. Geolocation, we would like to find out where the websites are located by searching the footers for address information, could be postal codes, city names, etc., and then try to figure out, are the websites living in the big cities or outside the big cities? We're also going to look at the networks, hyperlinks, and we're going to do that in two ways. We're going to focus on the networks kind of within each website. How many links point towards the website itself and how many points outside of the website. It can give us an impression of how closed are the websites on the national web, closed around themselves. Of course, we're also going to study the hyperlinks of the entire national web. Centrality based on in-degree links, yes. How well linked is the national web domain to the rest of the web? To which domains does the Danish web link, etc., etc. There's a lot of interesting things to get answers to here. Aliveness, as we call it, updating the domain names, simply the number of domain names, and Ditte is going to talk a lot more about that. How many new domain names have come each year? How many are inactive? How many have disappeared? And also calculating the number of, or how many web objects have been changed since the last year. So that's also what we're going to study. And then content, we're going to focus on actually what's on the web pages, something we call closedness. Find out how many websites are password protected. Gives you an impression of how closed the web is and how has that developed. File and software types, the most prevalent software types, file types. For instance, when did block software start, etc., etc. Which types of software are the most widespread? Language, of course, it's interesting for us to know how Danish is actually the Danish web. How much of the Danish web is written in Danish? How much is written in English, German, or what have we? And then another way of focusing on content, very basic things, but it could be extremely interesting to know. For instance, such things as the background color. What color is the Danish web? Could be fun to know. Fonts, which fonts are the most used, the length of web pages. I guess we all have an impression that web pages have grown and grown and grown. They're longer and longer. But is that actually correct? And which parts of the website is it that this is correct for? The menu items, we all know that suddenly the menu items switched from being left aligned to being horizontal. When did that happen? Has it developed? We want to study word frequencies. We want to do some kinds of topic studies. Where are specific topics discussed in the Danish web, and how has that developed over time? Yes, here you go.
Yeah. Okay, so we want to do all this, but it's not as easy as it sounds. There are some general methodological challenges. First of all, the web of the past is gone. We cannot simply go online and still find it. One solution then is, of course, to use the National Archive if you have one. And in Denmark, we do have one. We've been collecting since 2005 all websites aimed at a Danish audience. But we don't want to study the National Archive. We want to study the national web sphere. And there's not a one-to-one relationship between the two. There's not a one-to-one relationship between the two because the archive is not an exact copy of the national web sphere. First of all, not everything has been archived due to settings and technical deficiencies. The archive is very unsystematic. You cannot be sure how close your archive copy is to the original, and you have no original to compare with. And archiving takes time, so the link structure becomes very inconsistent. And deduplication means that if an identical copy of a given file is already in the archive, then it's not archived again, but it is discarded from the archiving. And this saves 40% storage, so that's very good. But it was maybe archived 2 years earlier than the year that you are interested in. So measures have to be taken to ensure that what was discarded during the archiving process can be recombined with the materials where it also belongs. And archiving strategies may be changed between two archivings. And finally, parts of domains may be harvested more than once. We will illustrate this last point. So the crawler will go to its designated domain and start to crawl the start URL. Then it'll follow the start URL's links. And some of these links might link back to URLs already crawled and crawl them again. So there's an inbuilt bias in the archive where some part of a domain are harvested more than once. In that way, a domain could appear smaller or bigger than they actually were when they were online. To complicate this further, in one job you may be crawling several domains. So this is crawling domain A, domain B, and domain C. But some of these domain URLs will link to each other, so the crawler will find URLs from these domains already crawled, like this. And it'll even find URLs that were missed earlier because somebody forgot to to link to it. How do I point here? Here is the mouse. So this one. Somebody forgot to link to this URL, but now it's crawled anyway. And you will also get URLs from domains not designated to the crawler's jobs. So this URL and that URL are not from domain A, B, and C. These are what we call by-harvest materials. So we have to distinguish between by-harvests and main harvest. So the main harvest contains objects within a domain which have been harvested in the job to which the harvest of the domain was assigned. And the by-harvest contains objects within a domain which have been harvested in another job than the one to which the harvest of the domain was assigned. So in this first job, you get a lot of objects from A, B, and C. This is the main harvest. So M and H is the main harvest. But you also get some objects from a domain not assigned to this job, like here. This domain was maybe assigned to the next job, where you then get some more of this domain. You get a lot more from this domain. And this job will contain other by-harvest materials and main harvest materials from other domains. And this will continue and continue. We'll come back to this later. But the point is, how can we go about all these methodological challenges? Well, we could choose not to use the archive at all. We could just choose to use the register of .dk domains, and then we'll have the development of the Danish websphere over time if we have the lists. Or we could try to create an unbiased corpus within the archive with one complete version of each domain. And we have tried both. So first of all, the register of .dk domains is simply a long list of domain names and their owners. And we took 4 lists from 4 years, over 10 years, you can see that. And we asked, what are the total number of domain names over time? How many domain names have disappeared compared to the previous years? And how many domain names have been created compared to the previous year? And how many domain names have changed hands compared to the previous years? And how is the relationship of ownership and domains over time? This will tell us something about the Danish websphere over 10 years. So the number of domain names is, of course, the most simple question. And what we see here is that over 10 years, the number is increasing. So it goes from 600,000 something to more than 1 million. But we also see that the increase is slowing down a bit. So we might head for a more stable number of domain names. And this result is, in fact, similar to a result done on .uk. And this graph, of course, says nothing about the number of active or non-active domains. We do not know anything about that. These are the new and disappearing domain names over 10 years. So from 2005 till 2009, 126,000 domains disappeared. And in the same period, 470,000 domain names was created. And we can also see that there's an increase over time in the number of disappeared domain names in the 3 years intervals, and a decrease over time in the number of created domain names in the same 3 years intervals. So the two lines are actually approaching each other, and that goes very well in hand with the slowing down increase in the total number of domain names we just saw on the previous slide. So the closer the two lines get, the more horizontal the line will be in the development of the total number of domain names. So again, this shows us that we might be heading for a more stable number of domain names. Interestingly, these lines also say something about the Danish web sphere dynamics, or aliveness, as Niels called it, because these two lines are symmetrical around an invisible horizontal line, and this means that the relationship between the increase in disappeared domain names and the decrease in created domain names is stable. So the dynamics or aliveness of the domain names is stable over time. When we look at ownership, we see that in 2015, 14% of the domains from 2012 had changed their owner name. That was actually more than we thought when we thought about it. So this is also a sign of aliveness, but in another way. So when owners are changing, probably content are changing. And just less 10% of the total number of owners own 50% of the Danish domains. And if you own more than 3 domains, you are part of the top 10% of domain owners. So actually, Niels, who owns more than 3 domains, are part of the top 10. This last slide shows us the relationship between, this shows the owner as a dot. So we have 2 owners who own more than 3,000 domains, but a lot of owners who own just 1 or 2 domain names. So in that way, you can actually get a lot to know about the Danish web sphere without even looking in the archive. And of course, when you do such an analysis, you should be aware that over 10 years, you cannot just use data without standardizing the data and cleaning up the data. I'll not go into that right now because we are in the interest of time. But just mention that, of course, this is just an first analysis, and we have some more questions who have come up that we can investigate, like, for instance, how many domain names disappear in one period and reappear in another period after how long time? Niels?
I guess you have one slide more.
Yes.
Okay, no, you didn't. Sorry. Well, let's then say that we didn't take the direction that Ditte talked about, studying only the registry of domain names, but also going into the archive and, okay, we want to study what's in the archive. And then we have to create a corpus. And why do we have that? Because, as Ditte told you, in the archive there is simply too much material, and it's a mess. So we would like to have, say, if we want to make a link analysis, it's not a good idea to have 10 versions of the same web page, because it simply ended up in the archive like that. So that will bias the analysis. At least you could think it would. So we have to have one version of each when we want to create a corpus. And we started to do that, and we sat down a lot of people, researchers, curators, IT developers, and also the management of the Danish Net Archive. And to discuss how can we create a corpus. It kind of should be simple, but it isn't that simple. We wanted to base it on the broad crawls, and you all know what broad crawl is, the entire Danish web. And how broad is a broad crawl and how is it performed, etc., etc. We had to get knowledge about that. When were they performed? Wasn't that obvious to find out exactly when they started and exactly when they ended. How to find the most complete of these broad crawls would be a nice thing to do. And then we also had some terminological problems. A scholar as me, I would say, okay, only one. Then I had to hurry up. What is a web element? I call stuff on a website a web element. For an IT developer, that doesn't give any sense. So, but I thought we had until we didn't. Ah, okay. We didn't know that. So I'll try to finish up very rapidly. The corpus creation, we started out with the broad crawls, and that's what we want to study. Selected 2 to 4 of them from the web archive. 2006, 9, 12, and 15. How had they developed? And this is the drawing that Ditte made before. And we have all these by harvests, and we had to figure out how to get around that. So what we tried to do is then to set up an algorithm that could, in a way, make this happen. That is, find all the noise that is by harvests and figure out how we can combine that with the main harvest. Yes, I'm going to skip that one. And this algorithm, our IT developer Ulrik Have, some of you know him, together with Per from NetLab, wrote that. And it was tested, or it is being tested right now on a very small crawl from 2006. 127 jobs. Each job has several domains in it, as Ditte talked about, and then they produced, or he produced, an 18 gigabyte crawl log, which was enhanced with the job IDs, as you can see it here. And then they used, or are going to use, IBM Big Insights, and then perform the algorithm on a large spreadsheet. To locate the objects that are not included in the main harvest, the so-called by harvests, and if there are duplicates, that is, if there are more by harvests, which of them are closest to the time of the main harvest. So this is what is going to happen, so to say. And then the next steps, what we're going to do when this is tested and we have started, we'll start to do the analysis and try to find out what shall we do with the crawl log. Are we going to open the WARC files and get access to the actual content? Or are we going to have a subset of an index that is being created right now of the entire Danish web archive? Can we identify a subset of that index and use that for our analysis? So that's some of the questions that we're discussing. And then, of course, we want to start making the analysis. Dissemination, we have a few book chapters coming up that are going to tell you the story about the Danish web and its development, some papers. And then we plan to make an open workshop in Aarhus 2016, where we would like to invite those of you here who would like to do similar studies in your country, to figure out how can we do that, try to establish some kind of transnational best practice, and share ideas. I guess that was a little bit more than a minute, Jason, but it was less than I had planned. Okay, that was it.
If anyone has some from that great talk there, please put your hand up if you have something to ask. I'm sure you do. Jay, we've got a mic coming, but
for one resolving location.
Did you hear that, everybody? Or?
We actually have the domain owner's name, but we don't have the address, so we couldn't get a feel for that. But it was actually one of the questions that we would like to ask. So if we could match the owner's name to some kind of address, we could do such a study, but we can't with the data that we have. We know the data exist, but we don't have them.
We got one here. We'll wait for a mic to come along.
So how do you deal with the private registrations where names are like a company name which acts on behalf of everyone that privately registered with them and don't make the names and addresses and contacts available to public?
Do you mean in the domain name registry?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So, just to understand you right, how do we deal with
So if I understood.
anonymous?
If
Yeah.
I understood it correctly, you were parsing the domain name registry publicly available data, like
Yes.
which domain name belongs to whom.
Yes.
And I, as a website owner, I might not want to reveal my identity,
Yes.
so I can do private registration, and it's very common practice.
Yes.
So some
It
company.
is. It is common practice. So we actually took the numbers out of this study, and the percentage was the same over the years. So we don't think it played a big part in our analysis. But yes, people will remain anonymous in some cases,
Okay.
and we don't have the data.
We've got someone right over here. If you could say who you are and where you work, that'd be great.
I'm Dan Kirshner from George Washington University Libraries. When you looked at the kind of drop-off in new registrations of .dk sites, were you able to put that in some kind of a context of whether that's due to an increase in using more generalized domain names for sites that may be truly Danish in character or location, but maybe there's a shift towards .com, .org, and all those others?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think we'll have to look into that.
Yeah, we haven't started looking that much into the data, into the names of the domains. And we're going to do that, and we hope that we'll get a lot of other good ideas when we get closer to the material, because it's right now, the latest year is 1.2 million domain names, and how do you look at that?
Yeah.
We'd like some good ideas from you, because
Exactly. Yes.
how can we
What kind of
get a
questions?
handle on these data and find out what's actually within these domain names? It's a big issue, and I don't know if any one of you have some good ideas. It would be nice to know.
Yeah. We were also talking about taking a more qualitative look at, for instance, the disappeared domain names, to look, are there some patterns? And we can also look at the domain names, how they are spelled, because some domain names point to the same domain, it's just different spellings. So should you count that as two domains, or is it the same domain? And some domains fake, that they look like Amazon.com. It's of course not a Danish example, but it's spelled with an S, for instance, and then it'll take you completely elsewhere. So you could actually take a closer look at these lists and investigate issues like that.
And that's where we're probably going into the archive anyway, because if we find some of the websites and domain names, and we would like to know more about them, we could then go to the archive and see what was on them actually.
I think we might have one more, and then we'll break for lunch. I think was it Nicholas? You had a question? If you just wait for a mic. Oh, sorry, we're not going for lunch yet. Sorry, we've got more to come.
Nicholas Taylor, Stanford University Libraries. I was curious, in your investigations of the size of websites, whether you had encountered heuristics for, like, if you were to archive the first page of a website, that might give you some cues to figure out what its size were, because it seems like something like that could be useful operationally for assessing, oh, this crawl is going to be this big, or something along those lines.
We haven't done anything like that, but it's a good idea, definitely. We could have that in mind when we, but I think what we want to do when we talk about the size of websites or web domains is simply to calculate, we could calculate it in bytes or in objects, and simply to see how big they are in terms of objects or bytes. But because we don't have to crawl it in a way, we have it already in the archive.
Thanks very much. Just show your appreciation for Niels Ditte, please.
We've actually run out of gold ink, but we can say tak, so thank you very much. Just by show of hands, just to make sure we get this right, in terms of lunch or listening to Andy do the next speech, just by who? So yes, I think as a good segue in terms of creating a corpus that Niels and Ditte talked about, Andy Jackson from the British Library, who's I guess the web archiving technical lead, is going to tell us what they've actually saved in the UK archive. So Andy, over to you.
Yes, so I'm the only thing between you all and lunch, so I'll try and be quick. What have we saved? Well, let me see if I can work out how to use the technology. Right. At the UK Web Archive, we have 3 collections, and we started saving back in 2004, a decade ago, and building up and that was all done by permission. And these days, we call that the Open UK Web Archive, because we can make it openly available. In part, this was considered a long-term investment in the infrastructure and skills we needed to take on domain crawls, which we've been doing since 2013 under non-print legal deposit legislation. I can't hold on to it. Furthermore, to ensure we have as complete a record as possible as the UK domain, thanks to the Internet Archive, we worked with JISC to get a copy of their copy of the .uk stuff and have a copy of that on our own storage systems. And that gives us a complete record as possible of the UK domain up until legal deposit was enacted. However, those legal regulations are due to be reviewed and actually, in principle, could be withdrawn. So what should we do? Well, in order to ensure the future of our collections and to reach these goals, we need to be able to better articulate the value of what we've saved. And to do this, we need a better understanding of our collections and how they can be used. So, if we step right back for a moment and look at what comes out of the crawlers and those 8 billion resources, what do we see? Well, WARCs themselves are just great big bundles of stuff, crawled resources, and they reflect the harvester and the baler, so to speak, and not really the need or the use. So obviously, like most of us at the most basic level, we find ways to open it up and take a look at it. And so, primarily, of course, we use Open Wayback or Wayback. And so this example is our earliest archive site, and it's quite a nice one because it's one we managed to reconstruct from a server-side copy of the BL's own website, and it's from back in 1995, and it's probably the earliest UK site that's archived anywhere. However, it has a problem. I don't know if you can tell, but the URL's not actually www.bl.uk, it's portico.bl.uk, because that's what it was called back then, and so you can only find this thing if you know that was its old name. There's obviously no links back in time from the more modern copies that make this clear. So you need to know what URLs you're interested in order to find them. So again, like many of the archives here, we also built up themed collections which bundle these resources together and make things browsable and discoverable. However, we're very keenly aware that we can't catalogue everything. We now archive 2 billion resources a year. We're not going to build collections around that. So to tackle that part of the problem, we've also been building full-text indexes of our collections. In effect, we've built a historical search engine that lets us a way into all of our stuff. Well, not yet all of it, but we're getting there. And having invested in that level of complexity, it's opened up a number of different ways to explore our archives. And the Big Data Research panel later on will look at what we've achieved there in some detail. But for now, I'm just going to talk about this very basic example. This graph shows the fraction of the UK domain that was on ac.uk hosts, academic hosts, versus co.uk hosts, commercial hosts over time. And so we can see that back in 1996, about half of the UK domain was ac.uk. However, since then, co.uk has come to dominate the picture, and ac.uk as a percentage is a very small fraction of the UK web now. Of course, overall, in absolute terms, both have grown massively, but this kind of compositional change is exactly the kind of overall trend you need to be aware of when you try and understand trends you see in the web, say in the usage of research or medical terms over time. So building this has been great fun, but these kind of user interfaces, they're difficult to build, and they're forced to make some fairly strong assumptions about what the users want, the kind of questions they want to ask. So we've tried to complement these bespoke tools with kind of rawer secondary data sets. So these kind of facts about our collections that are generated largely as a side effect of our content management provide a way for our more technically adept users to explore our data using their own tools. This provides a way of handing quite rich and interesting data to researchers, but without handing over the actual copyrighted content. And I think this is something of a theme now for many of the archives. And it's generated a reasonable number of publications so far. In particular, well, this process also pays dividends directly to us, in that the way researchers have attempted to exploit our collections has helped us better understand what they need and do a better job when we crawl the web. A simple example is one researcher took the link graph from 1996 and used it to test their graph layout algorithm and came up with this nice picture. Now, from a researcher's point of view, all the clusters of interlinked hosts in the middle are probably the most interesting bit. But actually, we learnt the most from the halo around the edge. Now, that halo is all of the sites which are in the .uk domain. They're in scope for legal deposit, but we won't find them by crawling unless we stray outside the .uk domain, because they're only linked to from .coms, .org, .net. They're not not linked to from within UK. So we can't build a truly representative picture of the UK domain unless we allow our crawlers somehow to stray outside it and back in again. The data generation and full text indexing processes we do also give us an opportunity to perform some deeper characterization of our content, such as format identification, feature identification, and scanning for preservation risks. To touch on the obsolescence issue, this has confirmed what many have suspected, that, I mean, by volume, the vast majority of content in the web archive is not going to go obsolete at the format level anytime soon. But if you dig deeper, it illustrates how poorly we understand the tail of formats and features in use. I'll give you an example. So HTML is 20 years old, and if you looked at the format level, it doesn't look obsolete. You can look at Tim Berners-Lee's early HTML in a modern browser, and it renders pretty much fine. But the devil's in the detail. What about the applet tag? Chrome doesn't support that tag anymore, so even if we reconstruct it via Wayback, Chrome won't play it back, because that tag's been obsolete for years and is being deprecated out of browsers. Similarly with Blink, which doesn't work anymore. Should we invest energy in reconstituting the Blink tag? Show of hands? I don't know. and other technologies which are more recent but still dying, like the font tag. One day a browser engine may choose to no longer support it. And of course our biggest problem, the growth, massive growth in the use of the script tag, from almost no web pages back in 1996 through to almost all web pages embedding JavaScript in these days. Those are percentage figures, but oh, yeah, it is clear, okay. Anyway, so this is all good stuff, but it's all looking inwards onto the archive. We also wanted to come at it another way and try and complement this approach by comparing our archive with other archives, but particularly with the live web. So this is an attempt to get at the most fundamental value web archives offer. The web is volatile, and we save things that aren't there anymore. How true is that? Or, to put that another way, how bad... I should have done that earlier. We want to try and contextualize our web and understand how bad the link rot problem really is, and how much of our collection is still out there on the live web. So if we want to understand how our kind of archival sliver of the web has changed, we need to go out and look at, one way of doing it is to take all our archived URLs and go and look at what happened to them since now. So for the open UK Web Archive, this is what we've been doing over that 10 years, more or less. Archiving more and more resources, tens of millions per year for most of the years since 2004. And then that kind of drop off at the end is as we switch over to legal deposit crawling. So obviously we're collecting a lot more material now, but this is just that. Now we can't go and visit all of those URLs again to see what's happened to them, but we don't need to. We can take a random sampling approach. So based on our Solar Index, we can randomly generate 1,000 URLs from every year. So we slice it up by year, randomly sample it. We'll make a little script, and it goes down, tries to download those URLs again from each year, classifies the results. If the host name doesn't resolve or is reachable, we call it gone. If errors, error. If it's a 404, we say it's missing. And if it does end up either via redirects or directly to a resource, we call that moved or OK. By now, we also look for soft 404, so that's when the server says not found, but the status code it returns is, oh, it's fine. We'd looked at the prevalence of that, and actually it's very low in the .uk domain for some reason. It's well under 1% of dead domains have, or old domains have that present, so that doesn't appear to be a factor So, plotting those results by year, we get this overall picture. So remember, this is just whether these URLs are still alive. And we find that just 2 years ago, 40% of those URLs are gone, missing, or the servers have died, nearly 20%. And this gets worse and worse as you go back in time, looking at older and older material. And a good chunk keep moving, and a fair few, 50%-ish for 2 years ago and then dropping off, appear to be okay. However, this, so far, only tells us the URLs are still active. The content of those resources could have changed completely. So that's just the link rot, so to speak. We want to know what the content is like underneath. So we tried to come up with a reasonably scalable and simple way of attacking that part of the problem. So we decided to do the following. If I take this, this is just an example web page for the National Institute of Health and Care Excellence from our archive. Well, this is the live version when I took it. So if we want to compare this page with the archive version, the simplest thing we could do is throw away all the tags, throw away all the images, throw away all the CSS, and just extract the text. It's a simple signal, but it's still generally an interesting one. However, comparing these big chunks of text is still quite clunky and cumbersome. It's very hard to scale. So we can go one step further and reduce that text to a fingerprint. Now, a fingerprint, most of us will be familiar with hashes and cryptographic hashes, right? So fingerprints are very much like those, with one very important difference. When you put a file into MD5 or SHA-256 or whatever, you get a hash out at the end. If you change just one bit in that input file, the output changes completely. And in fact, that's an important feature of those hashes, right? Now, a fingerprint, or a fuzzy hash in this case, if you change the input just a little, then the output changes just a little. So it's a lot shorter, a lot denser, a lot easier to manage than the body text, but it's sensitive to changes. And it lets you measure the degree of change between two resources. So those are the examples. Earlier this year, I got that value. From the archive, I got this value, and you can see it's about 50% the same. You'd have to edit 50% of the characters to get from one to the other. But there's a couple of differences up there, and then a great big difference at the end. So what's going on? Right, let's see if I can do this. I need to flick between two quickly. So that's the archive version, and that's the live version. Oh, can I flick back and forth? Nah. Is there a keyboard? I'm going to get an extra minute for this, right? No, it's anyway. It's okay, it's fine. As I flick between them, you can see a couple of small changes to the page. In the logo at the top, and the download speed, or the estimated download time in the middle there. And this appears to correspond to those two small changes up near the top of the fuzzy hash. But as you go, it doesn't explain that big long change at the end. Well, it turns out you need to look at the whole page, not just the top, because the server was having a bad day on the day we crawled it. It's a shame. When we crawled it in 2013, the server accidentally injected a copy of half of the page inside the page, and thus broke the footer totally, and was much longer and totally different to what the footer should have been. So, although this is a kind of relatively simplistic text fingerprint, we think it does more or less reliably reflect the position and degree of changes between versions of documents. So, if we take all of those URLs that looked okay before and run them through this and use this to estimate how similar those URLs are to the archive version, we get quite a bad picture. So the URL's resolved, but the content has drifted, has changed. Even in 2013, 40% of the content is unrecognizably different to how it was in the archive. And this gets much worse as you go back. And the little sliver of blue across the top is the identical stuff, the stuff that's binary identical to the archive version, which is very, very small percentage indeed. Out of interest, this same tactic can also be used to compare the OK and moved resources to each other. And so we can see after 2 years, if a URL says that it's still there, it's OK. Actually, there's a 1/3% chance. 1/3%. There's a third of a chance. No, there's 33% chance that it's identical. And then a further third that it's similar, but actually a third of the time it'll have changed completely in just 2 years. Whereas, perhaps not surprisingly, if it's moved, it's a lot more likely to be different and a lot less likely to be identical. If we combine this similarity data with the overall results for the URLs, we get a big, fuller picture. The URLs ain't cool. It's very clear that very few of the archive resources are still available, unchanged, on the current web. After just 2 years, 60% of the content has gone or changed into something unrecognizable. To be frank, this rot rate is a lot higher than I expected. It's a lot higher than the legal and scientific corpora that I've seen this kind of analysis in before. And so I wondered if this was a bias due to the Open Web Archive collection. We often prioritize sites that are going offline. So I was thinking, well, maybe this is just because it's this selective archiving, and that's kind of driving this process. You'll be lucky. No. And so I ran the same analysis over the legal deposit collection for the last 2 years. So now I'm sampling 2,000 URLs out of 2 billion a year. And actually, the picture's basically the same. If you look at 2013, 60% of the content is totally unrecognizable after just 2 years. And only 1 year, the figure's 50%. So, yeah, seriously, we lose 50% of the UK web a year. I was quite surprised by that. It's a lot higher than I was expecting. This raised the question whether this instability might be traceable to specific parts of the web. Maybe, surely, academic websites, ac.uk, are more stable than co.uk, for example. So I did that breakdown, and no. Actually, the worst offenders from 2013, and 14 in this case, NHS and gov.uk, but they've both been restructured in that time period, so that's probably what's happening there. And co.uk and ac.uk and org.uk are all kind of equally quite bad. Pulling all of this open and legal deposit data together, we can get a full view of the situation across the entire decade. For me, this big black hole of content lost from the live web is a very powerful way of visualizing the value of what we've saved over those last 10 years. Honestly, I'm just going to leave that there for a minute. Anyway, actually, I may even be on time yet. So, in summary, I expected the rate to be high, but I was shocked, actually, by how quickly link rot and content drift seem to dominate the scene. 50% is lost after 1 year, with more being lost every subsequent year. It is, I suppose, worth noting that the loss rate is not maintained at 50% every year. Otherwise, after 2 years, we'd have 75% gone, not 60%, right, if we're losing half every year. So there are some islands of stability under there that we don't yet understand. And this also indicates that kind of broad measures like average lifetime aren't really meaningful because they don't carry through the importance of those islands and the distribution of stabilities we find. But we don't know where they are yet. We've also found that this relatively simplistic text-based measure does provide useful insight, but we want to pick it apart some more. We do know it's overly, it's only sensitive to text changes, and it's perhaps overly sensitive to the way the furniture of a website changes. A small change in the menu can look quite as significant as a small change in the body text. But it is useful, and more importantly, it is scalable. So there are a number of ways we might try and take this work forward. I'm particularly interested in looking for migrated content. So those fingerprints and hashes are all in our Solr index. So if a resource was at one URL and has moved to some totally different, unrelated URL that never had a redirect or any kind of association, I can now find them not only if they're identical, but also if they're sufficiently similar, using our full text search index. So I'd love to spend more time studying how content has migrated around the UK web and understand how popular content shifts around over time. I'd also like to extend the same sampling analysis to allow ourselves to compare our archives with other archives across the world. And that's it. Thank you. Are there any questions? Shall I stay here?
Yeah.
No.
We've got a good 10 minutes for questions. So one at the back there, Brenda, I think.
From University of North Texas. I was wondering if you're comparing similarity for textual data and you're using the deep hash algorithm. So I was wondering, how would you compare non-textual data such as video or images or style sheets? Obviously, maybe a site had a video that was replaced by a different video or images that were different. How would you do that?
Don't know. Any judgment of similarity means some value judgment about what the most important features of a medium are. So we'd have to pick something. And I don't quite know how I'd do that yet. It's a very good question. I don't know. One option would be to screenshot the videos and start to compare the kind of color spectrum, color histograms of images. We do screenshot the websites. We crawl now, mid-crawl from the live web. So that would be one possibility, is we could start to do color or structure-based comparisons with the images that we found. Those will be much more computationally expensive to build than the hash-based text analysis I've done so far. So it's that scalability has driven the current simplicity of the approach. But it would be lovely to spend more time researching that in the future.
We've probably heard plenty from Jay and Nicholas. Anyone else?
You've scared everyone off now.
Anyone? Oh, Jay, you're in.
Thank you very much, Jay, from the National Library of New Zealand. Andy, 2007 looked like there were some interesting things happening. Do you think that was just a function of the random generation of URLs? Or do you think that there was actually something around technology that may be a lesson that we could be keeping an eye on?
I can get there quickly. I would. There's a problem in that, you remember the number of resources we archived over time? It drops as you go back in time. So the graph, I'd expect the graph to get noisier as you get further back, because I'm sampling only 1,000 URLs out of a smaller global corpus. So I don't know how much to read into that at the moment. Again, to kind of repeat this analysis over the a big chunk of the Internet Archives collection or something like that, you'd get something a bit more meaningful. But I only looked at the selective archive for this analysis. So that would be my next step, is to understand whether that's statistically significant before I try and infer the underlying cause.
I think we've got Nicholas at the front. Had a question. And I want somebody else to think of something.
Could you talk a little bit more about what it would take for other archives to do a similar kind of analysis?
So to do the baseline analysis, you don't need a full text search index at all. You do need a way of generating 1,000 URL random sample from every year of your crawl. So you have to resample your crawl logs or your CDX and kind of correct for the to make sure you do it appropriately. So you make sure you pull a 1,000 uniformly picked. You don't accidentally pull 1,000 from 2 years and 1,000 from 1 year because of your crawl overall crawl profile. But then once you've done that, the script that does it is a Python notebook that is already available. So you can just run that list through that script, and it will generate these graphs. So you don't. That's the main thing you need.
I think we've got Helen over here.
Hi, my name's Helen. I work with Andy at the British Library.
Right,
so when I can't figure something out, I ask Andy. I'm doing this again. So I'm thinking about Niels' presentation and Andy's. So, and also you said it would be interesting, which I agree, to do the same sort of analysis on other national domains. So there's this thing called deduplication, which I have never really understood. So I'm thinking, to do your sort of analysis, I'm assuming you didn't address duplication or deduplication because you took random URLs. So we don't deduplicate content, do we?
This was from a non-deduplicated source.
Yeah. So my question is, because Niels is trying to form a corpus with deduplicated content. He doesn't want the same URLs counted multiple times. He wants it once. So I'm just trying to string the two together. When you apply your analysis to his scenario, his corpus, how would that work?
Well, it might help. So to address that, when we do the full text search system you'll be seeing later, that does reduplicate deduplicated data. However, that's better than not doing, but it's also a little bit misleading because it exactly touches on this similarity issue. If a given URL has the same hash, exactly the same content, in 1 year, it counts once when you do the kind of graph analysis that we do. However, the way our index is, if it changes by a tiny bit, it counts twice. And that's probably not fair, right? But then neither's making it count 3 times because you crawled it 3 times and it happened to be different. So we have to to get the bias as fair as possible. You can't remove it completely. We have to find some way of using a similarity measure to say, well, actually that URL, the 3 times we crawled that URL, it was effectively the same. So we should only count it once when we infer anything from it. And we don't know how to do that properly yet, right? But it's an open area where we kind of need to work out how best to define whether a resource has changed over time when we're trying to track trends in publication and usage. It's quite messy.
We've got more time if anyone has another question. No, Daniel, right at the front here. Just wait for a mic.
Hi, I'm Daniel from the Portuguese Web Archive. Nice talk. Thank you very much. So first question, really quick. Do you have a report or a paper that describes all this work?
I just said it, man.
Sorry.
No, it hasn't been written up formally yet. Right now, I have like this and the script for this and the Python notebook that generated the graphs from the data, and I'm happily sharing all of that already. I would hope to write this up a bit more formally at some point. I was hoping to do that amongst other things for the RESOR conference later this year, but that's fallen off my plate because it's too full right now. But yes, I would seek to do that in the future, yeah.
Okay, and about the results for the legal deposit law, that collection was created through broad crawls of the .uk domain?
Yes, we do. We whitelist in a few thousand non.UKs, and in the 2014 crawl we used GeoIP-based identification, so we got quite a lot more non-UKs that are geolocated in the UK. But in essence, yes.
Thank you.
Sorry.
We've got time for one more, if there is. In that case, can I ask you to put your hands together for Andy, please? And the moment you've all been waiting for is lunch. But I hope you found the talks very stimulating. Certainly I have. And to give you an opportunity to have plenty of time to talk to each other, we've got an hour and a half for lunch. But if I can ask you to be back at your seats at 2 o'clock, that would be fantastic. And we've got another action-packed afternoon. Thanks very much.